Two things to pass around. These are not related to my talk, but you're the people to give them to. These are press releases for two books. One is the collected prose of Ted Berrigan called Get the Money, which is being published by City Lights in September of this year. It's already available for pre-order. I helped edit that book with Al Sotley and Anselm and Eddie Berrigan. And with the press release for Get the Money, I've attached a printout of Berrigan's review in Culture magazine of O'Hara's lunch poems, where Ted describes finding, I use that verb, finding his copy of Meditations in Emergency at the Library of Congress. And then also coming around this way is a press release for two books by Al Sotley that are forthcoming in March of next year. One is the 650-page new book called the Speak Angel series. And the other, which I edited, is called Early Works. It's all of Alice's first 4 books of poetry, along with a lot of uncollected work. And there's one of her poems attached to the back of that, which is really good, about rage. I also want to say, too, with Kristen's presentation, that I just before I kind of dismissed Bernadette's science writing book, and you just totally corrected me, so thank you. I think it's great, actually. Okay. So this talk is called Provisional New York Schools, Little Magazines, and Generational Thinking. And what you see here, these are two examples of contributor networks to little magazines that were created by my students. So these are the visualization on the left these are all 58 issues of The World that were ever published at the Poetry Project. So all the blue nodes are the issues of The World, and all of the yellow nodes are individual contributors. So you see the full range of that publication's existence as a community. And then here on the right, this is a contributor network for Maureen Owen's Telephone magazine, all issues. The green nodes are the magazine, and then this student coded the contributors by gender. So you see the gender distribution in Telephone, which is something that Maureen's always talking about with her magazine. Discussions about the New York School are yoked to a rhetoric of generations, which has come up today as well in our talks. A situation that's unique among the aesthetic lineages generated out of Donald Allen's anthology, The New American Poetry. This generational thinking tends to operate in two ways. The most common is for scholars to cast the New York School in first and second generations as a way of giving an organic, temporal reality to a narrative of literary inheritance. This narrative operates at the expense of second-generation poets such as Ted Berrigan and Waldman and Ron Padgett, who are defined as imitative of their aesthetically superior predecessors, first-generation poets like Ashbery, Schuyler, Coke, and O'Hara. The work of these first-generation poets is elevated as both original and originary by maintaining this, quote, difference from a generation gap between, end quote, them and a set of always younger poets. When David Lehman writes of the second generation that, quote, all too often their poems are so derivative as to appear virtually indistinguishable, end quote, or when Marjorie Perloff describes them as, quote, the growing cult of Frank O'Hara, end quote, a diverse community of writers is reduced to a homogeneous set of acolytes. In these cases, labeling a poet as part of a second generation New York School signals that we should read them as of secondary importance, if at all. Though generational designations might appear to be neutral descriptions of linear aesthetic inheritance, they operate as descriptions of disaffiliation, cordoning off poets to more easily prescribe canonical inclusions and exclusions. The other generational trope that we're all familiar with is this attempt to account for groupings that follow the aesthetic and geographical dispersal of the second generation, with poets and scholars variously imagining a second and a half generation New York School, which is the kind of most maddening, insisting that there exists third and fourth generations, and even claiming a fifth wave as well as a post-New York School. I imagine I think we can all agree that these speculative groups and their conflicting timelines result in some disheveled, if not totally frustrating and chaotic descriptions, which has come up a couple of times today, referred to second generation or first generation, so-called, all these sort of problems we have with our discourse about the New York School. So what I'm proposing is, if the result of generational thinking is either to inscribe canonical divisions or force us to juggle a set of disjointed and contextless perpetual inheritances, one might ask what value we get from continuing to use these descriptions. It's true that generational thinking allows for a convenient shorthand when citing perceived divergences in group formations. Its usage is so habitual in discussions of the New York School that it's sometimes challenging to not rely on this established terminology. However, thinking in generations filters poets into convenient, albeit incoherent sets that make the gestures of literary scholarship more workable at the expense of describing the entanglements and unacknowledged affiliations within these avant-garde networks. Despite the entrenchment of this rhetoric in writing on the New York School, the persistence of generational thinking and questions about its efficacy have been largely overlooked. We agree with that, right? It's like frustrating to have to use these terms all the time. So to pivot, so what do we do about that? Asked what he thinks about the New York School and his own role in it, Ted Berrigan prefaces his detailed response with an important qualification, quote, "You have to understand that nobody does quite understand this fully." Berrigan goes on to describe how editing the little magazine C, a journal of poetry, helped him form an idea about what constitutes the New York School. As Berrigan says, "The younger people to begin with were Ron Padgett and Dick Gallup, the painter Joe Brainerd, and myself. And not long after that, I met some other people like Jim Brody and Joe Cherivolo, and I put them in C Magazine too. And then I realized that there was such a thing as New York School because there was a second generation. So in essence, we were the New York School because these guys, although they were the real New York School, weren't doing anything about it, and we were." And that struck me as very funny. As Daniel Kane notes, quote, "Berrigan and C were perhaps most responsible for defining what has come to be known as the second generation New York School." I'm going to kind of give you hell for that. So it's like, however, Berrigan's elliptical genealogy suggests a more complex story that is less about definitions and more about what's provisional and heterogeneous within this community of poets. In this telling, what forms the New York School is the recognition of a variable lineage playing out in the pages of a little magazine. C is the publishing context in which the first and second generation New York schools are constituted simultaneously as groups of poets absorbed and transformed a set of influences that were, in the early 60s, still very nascent and dispersed. In other words, a New York School does not exist as such until it is articulated in the material medium of the little magazine. And there's even kind of like a number problem. Like there can't be a second generation, and there's not a first generation until there's a second, right? Like we don't kind of talk about that. Like, so the second generation constitutes the first generation. It's actually a kind of temporal reversal. Paying attention to the contexts where avant-garde artists appear together and in proximity to one another in little magazines, editing small presses, participating in readings, shows not only how transient and temporary these associations can be, but also how much more complexity there is within these avant-garde networks. As Berrigan suggests, there is such a thing as New York School, but it's bound up in the spontaneous particulars of a range of interdisciplinary activities and hard-to-find primary sources. The proliferation of little magazines in this period, when I'm saying the early to mid-1960s, such as Berrigan's C, makes them a vital medium not only for tracing the aesthetic choices of individual writers and editors, but also for the entanglements they inscribe into and between avant-garde networks. The value of these sources for generating renewed literary histories is skillfully articulated by other scholars. I swear I wrote this before I knew you would both be here, including Daniel's study of the Lower East Side in the 1960s and Anne's feminist genealogy of language writing, both of which take seriously Alan Golding's claim that closer attention to those magazines would force us to see literary history not only as a history of individual careers, important books, and competing discourses, but also as a history of writing communities. Sophie Setta's study, Provisional Avant-Gardes, Little Magazine Communities from Dada to Digital, is exemplary in this regard, offering a scholarly model that acknowledges that the magazine is the medium through which we can analyze the collective and collaborative work of writers, editors, and readers across time, and that artists on the periphery of an avant-garde group can revise our understanding of that group. As she asks, could avant-garde groups be described with a sensibility that emerges from material objects and the publishing context of their work, and with an approach that remains open to multiple definitions? The correspondence I'm posing between the publishing context of C and the very idea of the New York School show how active the terms of Setta's inquiry are for exploration of these poets' work. So in conclusion, instead of parsing out the New York School based on generational demarcations, I'm arguing that we should be grounding these poets' affiliations in mediums like little magazines. Contexts that begin to emphasize the social and aesthetic variousness of their actual activities and associations. In other words, studying little magazines and teaching with little magazines as primary sources allows us and our students to describe an overlapping series of provisional New York schools, like this research project on Mother, which was created just this month by 3 of my students at Georgia State University, Mercedes, Maddie, and Juania. I think this is a kind of ideal example of what that work might look like. I'm going to sort of see, does this open it?
It should. If you click on it. No. Is there a link?
Yeah, it's like embedded there.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Why is it?
Maybe it's dead.
No.
Yeah, it's perfect. So 3 of my students collaborated. This is their website, analyzing Mother. These aren't English majors. These are first-year writing students just doing a research project. And this is the data analysis, the contributor network that they made for Mother. So you can see the community of this particular little magazine in a way that's really challenging in the archive, because studying periodicals, you find, you have a stack of little magazines in front of you. Reading them is just, you don't want to do it. And it's kind of horrible to read them in a way, but they're so important. So how can you see them all at once? And this is, I think, a really interesting way to do that. As John Bernard Myers describes the aesthetic capaciousness of the visual artists, this approach gets us closer to seeing a writing community that includes, quote, the full gamut of avant-garde directions called the New York School. Thank you.